Talk show host Steve Harvey cries after emotional message from Ibrahim Traoré. The studio was filled with excitement as Steve Harvey walked onto the stage, smiling and waving at the cheering audience. The lights were bright, the cameras were rolling, and the energy in the room was just as strong as it always was whenever Steve hosted his show. People had come expecting to laugh, to hear jokes, and to see the usual mix of fun and heartwarming moments that made his program so loved. Steve was known for his ability to make people laugh until their sides hurt, but also for his wisdom and life lessons that often touched the heart. On this day, however, something unexpected was waiting for him. The producers had prepared a surprise that Steve did not know about. He believed it would be another usual episode filled with humor, audience interaction, and perhaps a moving story from a guest. But behind the scenes, the team had arranged something that would reach deep into Steve's heart in a way he had never experienced before. As Steve stood in the center of the stage, cracking a joke to warm up the audience, one of the producers gave a signal. The large screen behind him lit up. Steve turned, curious, and asked in his familiar voice, "Now what's this y'all got for me today?" The audience laughed lightly, thinking it might be another funny video or a surprise guest to make the show lively. But as the image on the screen became clear, the atmosphere began to shift. The face of Ibrahim Traoré appeared on the screen. Many in the audience recognized him instantly. He was the young leader from Africa who had recently captured the attention of the world with his boldness, honesty, and powerful words about justice, dignity, and truth. His presence alone carried a sense of seriousness and inspiration. Steve looked at the screen with surprise, not sure what was about to happen. His eyes widened, and he leaned slightly forward as if trying to understand why someone like Ibrahim Traoré would appear on his show. The audience clapped in amazement. They hadn't expected to see such a figure in the middle of a talk show. For Steve, this was completely out of the ordinary. He had met countless celebrities, politicians, and world leaders in his lifetime, but this was different. Ibrahim Traoré was not appearing for publicity or promotion. He was appearing for a reason that Steve was yet to discover. For a moment, the studio became silent. The air felt heavy with anticipation. Steve, always quick with words, found himself unusually quiet. He placed a hand on his chest and smiled, almost nervously, saying, "Well, I'll be. I wasn't expecting this." The crowd laughed lightly, but they too could feel that this moment carried more weight than usual. Behind the scenes, the producers smiled. They knew Steve's reaction would be heartfelt. They had planned this carefully because they wanted to give him a moment that would go beyond entertainment, something that would remind him of his influence, his journey, and the way his voice had touched millions across the globe. Ibrahim Traoré began to speak, but before his voice filled the room, Steve simply stared at the screen, still processing what was happening. The leader's calm presence contrasted with the lively setting of a television talk show. It was like two worlds meeting: the world of entertainment and laughter, and the world of courage, truth, and deep meaning. At this point, Steve had no idea what Ibrahim was going to say. He only knew that whatever it was not ordinary. He adjusted his suit jacket, cleared his throat, and sat down, giving the screen his full attention. The audience, sensing the seriousness of the moment, also grew quieter. As the introduction played out, Steve's mind began to wander back to his own journey. He remembered the difficult times when he had been homeless, sleeping in his car, struggling to feed himself while chasing his dream of becoming a comedian. He thought about the days when success seemed impossible, and the only thing that kept him going was his faith in God and his belief that one day, his life would change. Standing there now, successful, admired, and loved by millions, Steve had often reflected on how far he had come. But hearing from someone like Ibrahim Traoré, a man from across the ocean who carried such strength and moral power, was something that humbled him even more. He wondered what connection this young leader felt toward him. Why would Ibrahim Traoré take time to appear on his show and speak directly to him? The audience could see the curiosity on Steve's face. He was not cracking jokes anymore. He was listening with the full weight of his heart. For once, the man who usually had all the words seemed speechless. The atmosphere in the studio changed from excitement to reverence. People in the crowd began to lean forward, waiting to hear the message. The cameras zoomed in on Steve's face, capturing his genuine expression of wonder and humility. The moment no longer felt like a talk show, it felt like something spiritual, something deeper than entertainment. In that instant, Steve realized that this was not just a surprise for television ratings. It was a gift meant for him personally. He felt it in his heart, even before Ibrahim spoke his first words. It was as if God himself had arranged this encounter to remind Steve of the power of his own life story, and to show him how far his influence reached. As the first words from Ibrahim began to flow, Steve sat back, his hands clasped together. His usual laughter was replaced by silence, his strong voice replaced by careful listening. He didn't know what was coming, but he knew one thing: this was about to be a moment he would never forget. The audience, sensing the sacredness of the event, stayed quiet too. Their usual clapping and cheering gave way to stillness. It was the kind of silence that said, "Something important is happening here." And so, in that unexpected moment on stage, the man known for making millions laugh found himself facing a surprise that would instead make him reflect, listen, and eventually break down in a way no one could have predicted. The large screen glowed brightly in the studio, and the calm voice of Ibrahim Traoré began to fill the room. His tone was steady, filled with sincerity and warmth. He was not speaking with the force of a politician giving a speech, but with the gentleness of a brother reaching out to another brother across the ocean. "Brother Steve," he began, his accent soft but strong, "I want to speak to you today not as a leader, not as a politician, but as a man who has seen your journey and felt inspired by it." The audience listened closely. Steve leaned forward in his chair, his eyes fixed on the screen. It was rare for him to be this quiet on his own stage, but something about Ibrahim's words had already touched him. Ibrahim continued, "Many of us in Africa, even though we are far away, we watch you. We listen to your words, your stories, and your lessons. You do not know how much strength you have given to people you may never meet." Steve's eyebrows lifted slightly. He placed a hand on his chest as if to silently say, "Me." He was a man who had always been grateful for his blessings, but to hear that his life and words had traveled so far and carried meaning for people across continents was overwhelming. Ibrahim's message grew deeper. He spoke about family, values, and the struggles that every human being faces. "Life is not easy," he said. "It tests us, it pushes us, and sometimes it breaks us down. But when we look at people like you, Steve, we are reminded that faith, patience, and hard work can lead us through even the darkest of times." The camera caught Steve's face closely now. His usual big smile was gone, replaced with an expression of seriousness and humility. His eyes shone with moisture as he listened. The audience could see that the words were reaching places in his heart that were not often touched on television. Ibrahim went on, "I know that you have faced struggles. You have known what it means to be poor. You have known what it means to be hungry. You have known what it means to cry alone. And yet, you never gave up. You stood tall, and today, you make millions of people laugh. You give them hope. You remind them to keep believing in God's plan. Do you know how powerful that is?" Steve could no longer hide his emotions. He pressed a hand against his lips, looking down for a moment as the audience watched in silence. A few people in the crowd wiped tears from their eyes as well. The energy in the studio was unlike anything the show had ever experienced before. Ibrahim's words carried no politics, no agenda, no demand. It was pure appreciation, spoken with honesty. He continued, "In my country, and across Africa, young people face many difficulties. They wonder if their dreams can ever come true. But when they see you, Steve Harvey, a man who rose from nothing, a man who refused to quit. They believe that they too can rise. You have become a light not just in America, but across the world. Steve lifted his head again and looked at the screen. His lips trembled slightly. For a man who had made a career out of speaking, he suddenly found himself unable to form words. He simply nodded, acknowledging the truth of what Ibrahim was saying. The audience remained silent, deeply moved. Some people held their breath, not wanting to miss a single word. It was as if everyone in the room had been invited into a sacred conversation between two men who had never met but shared a connection stronger than distance. Ibrahim's voice grew softer, more personal. Steve, I want to tell you something important. Many people in this world think success is about money or fame. But true success is about how many lives you touch, how many hearts you lift, and how many people you give courage to. By that measure, you are one of the richest men alive. And I honor you for that. Steve closed his eyes briefly as tears finally rolled down his cheeks. He did not care about hiding them. He had always been open about his emotions, but this moment was different. This was not scripted, not staged. It was raw, and it was real. The audience slowly began to clap, but it wasn't the usual loud cheering. It was gentle, respectful applause that carried more feeling than noise. They were clapping not just for Ibrahim, not just for Steve, but for the truth that was being spoken in front of them. Ibrahim continued, "We may be far apart in distance, but our hearts are connected. Your story gives us strength. Your faith teaches us patience. And your laughter reminds us that even in pain, joy can still exist. Do not ever forget the lives you have touched, Steve Harvey. You are more than a talk show host. You are a messenger of hope." At that moment, Steve leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his face buried in his hands. He was crying openly now, and the audience could feel every tear. It was not weakness, it was gratitude. It was the release of years of memories, struggles, and victories that came flooding back to him through Ibrahim's words. The cameras captured this rare side of Steve, the man behind the suit, behind the jokes, behind the fame. This was Steve Harvey, the human being, reminded of the power of his own story by a leader who understood struggle in his own way. The audience remained deeply touched. Many were crying softly, others were holding their hands over their hearts. The atmosphere in the studio had shifted completely. It was no longer just a show, it had become an unforgettable moment of human connection. When Ibrahim paused, Steve finally lifted his head again. His eyes were red, his cheeks wet, but he managed a small, humble smile. He pointed toward the screen and said softly, thank you, man." His voice cracked, and he had to stop speaking for a moment to collect himself. Ibrahim smiled warmly from the screen. His message was still not over, but the impact was already visible. What he had given Steve was not just a compliment, it was a recognition of his life's meaning, a reminder that the struggles of yesterday had created the blessings of today, and that those blessings were not just his, but a gift to the world. As the message continued, Steve knew one thing for sure: he would never forget this day. It was the day a man from across the world reminded him that his laughter was more than entertainment, it was healing, it was strength, and it was hope. Steve Harvey sat there quietly, his eyes still wet with tears, as Ibrahim Traoré's words continued to echo in the studio. The audience remained hushed, their focus locked on the large screen. It was as though time had slowed down, and every second was filled with meaning. Steve, who was known for his quick humor and constant flow of jokes, now found himself in a role he was not used to, simply listening, silently, as another man spoke straight to his heart. Ibrahim's tone shifted as he began to speak more personally. "Steve," he said, "you may not realize this, but people in Africa know your story. They know how you rose from hardship, how you fought against the odds, and how you built yourself up with nothing but faith and determination. They know you not only as a comedian or a television host, but as a man who proves that dreams can survive even the hardest battles. Steve tilted his head slightly, his face filled with surprise. He knew he was popular in America, and he knew his shows had been broadcast in different countries, but hearing that people in faraway lands, people with different lives, cultures, and challenges had been inspired by him was something he never truly imagined. The audience could sense that Steve was taking in every word deeply. He clasped his hands together, rested them on his lap, and leaned forward, giving Ibrahim his full attention. Ibrahim went on, "When we watch you, we do not only see a man who tells jokes. We see a man who has fallen many times but has always stood back up. That is the kind of strength that the world needs today. And I want you to know, Steve, that in my country, many young people look to you. They see your struggles, they see your victories, and they believe that if you can make it, then maybe they can make it too." The words pierced through Steve's heart. He felt humbled, almost overwhelmed. It reminded him of his early years, the days when he was broke, when he lived inside his car for 3 years, washing up in gas station bathrooms, and eating whatever he could afford. He had thought those days were just painful memories of survival, but now Ibrahim was showing him that even those dark times carried a greater purpose. They had become a source of strength for people across the globe. Steve wiped his face with a tissue the production team had quietly handed him. He laughed softly through his tears and said, "Man, I didn't know y'all were watching me like that." The audience chuckled gently, not because it was funny, but because Steve was being so honest and vulnerable. Ibrahim continued, "Your story has crossed borders. You are proof that God lifts people up in His own time. You teach us patience, Steve. You teach us resilience. You teach us that even when the world says no, faith can still say yes. And that lesson is not American, it is not African, it is human. It belongs to everyone." The room filled with a sense of unity. For the audience, it was no longer about watching a talk show. It was about being part of a moment where two men, from two different worlds, connected through shared values and truth. Steve's shoulders shook slightly as he tried to hold back another wave of emotion. He remembered how often he had prayed in silence during his darkest days. He remembered crying out to God, asking why life was so hard. And now, years later, here he was being told by a young leader thousands of miles away that his journey had meaning beyond what he ever expected. The connection became more personal as Ibrahim said, "Steve, you speak of family, of faith, of never forgetting where you came from. Those words are the same lessons we try to teach our children. And when they see you, they see a man who did not let pain define him, but instead used pain as fuel to rise higher. That is the message that touches our hearts." The audience, many of them parents, nodded quietly. Some wiped their eyes, others reached for their partner's hand. They understood what Ibrahim was saying because Steve's journey was not just about fame, it was about survival, faith, and the will to keep moving forward. Steve took a deep breath, as if trying to steady himself. He looked out at the audience for a moment, then back at the screen. His lips trembled slightly, and he whispered, "Wow. I didn't know my life was reaching that far." The studio was so quiet that even the faintest sound seemed loud. Everyone was hanging onto each word, waiting for what Ibrahim would say next. Ibrahim smiled warmly and continued, "We live in a world that tries to divide us. But your laughter, Steve, it does the opposite, it unites us. A man in America laughs, a child in Africa laughs, a woman in Europe laughs, and suddenly, we are all the same. You may think you are only telling jokes, but what you are really doing is healing hearts. You are giving people moments of joy in a world that can be very heavy." Steve's tears flowed freely now. He covered his face with both hands, and the audience clapped softly, as if to comfort him. He looked up after a moment, and in a shaky voice, he said, "Man, you don't know what this means to me." The truth was, Steve did know what it meant. For years, he had worked tirelessly to build his career, to take care of his family, to inspire people with his words. But there were times he wondered if it truly mattered, if anyone really cared beyond the surface. Now, sitting on his stage, hearing the words of a man like Ibrahim Traoré, he knew without doubt that his life had carried meaning across the world. The connection between the two men was unshakable, even though they were separated by distance. It was not a connection of fame or business, but of humanity. Steve was a man who rose from struggle to success. Ibrahim was a man who stood boldly for truth and dignity. Both of them understood what it meant to face trials, and both of them believed in hope. The audience sensed that this was no ordinary exchange. They were witnessing a moment that would be remembered, a moment where a man who had given so much joy to others was now receiving joy in return, not through laughter, but through recognition and love. As Ibrahim's words came to a pause, Steve sat back in his chair, still holding the tissue in his hand. He looked up at the screen with gratitude and whispered, "Thank you, brother, thank you for reminding me." And though the message was not yet over, everyone in the room already knew that something powerful had happened. Steve Harvey, the man who always made others cry with laughter, was now crying himself because he had been reminded that his life, his struggles, and his faith had touched the world in ways he never imagined. Steve Harvey sat frozen in his chair, the tissue trembling slightly in his hand. The audience watched him with quiet respect, knowing they were witnessing a side of Steve rarely seen on television. He was always the strong one, the funny one, the man who could turn any situation into laughter. But this time, he was not hiding behind jokes or humor. He was raw, vulnerable, and completely open as Ibrahim Traoré's words continued to pour into his heart. Ibrahim's voice carried on from the large screen, calm and filled with conviction. "Brother Steve," he said, "the world often celebrates fame and riches. But what truly matters is the impact we leave on others. And today, I want to tell you that you have impacted more lives than you will ever know." Steve lowered his head, his shoulders shaking gently. He pressed the tissue against his eyes, wiping away tears that would not stop flowing. The cameras zoomed in on his face, capturing a man who was not acting for the spotlight, but feeling every ounce of emotion within him. The audience remained silent. No one wanted to interrupt the sacredness of the moment. The only sounds were Steve's faint sniffles and Ibrahim's heartfelt words echoing across the studio. "Do you know what it means, Steve?" Ibrahim continued, "when a young boy in Africa, who feels hopeless, looks at you and says, 'If he can rise, maybe I can too'? Do you know what it means when a young girl, who has lost faith, listens to you speak about God's plan and finds hope again? That is your true wealth. That is your true legacy." Steve lifted his head again, his face red from crying, and whispered, "Man, you don't know how much that means to me." His voice cracked as he tried to speak, and he placed a hand over his heart as if to hold himself together. The audience felt his pain and his gratitude at the same time. Some clapped gently, while others wiped their own eyes. Many of them had followed Steve's story for years, but seeing him like this reminded them of the man behind the laughter, the man who had walked through storms before standing in the spotlight. Ibrahim's tone grew gentler now, almost like that of a father speaking to a son, though he was younger than Steve. "You see, Steve, sometimes life breaks us down to rebuild us stronger. Your journey is not only about you. It is about all those who find courage through you. And I want you to know, my brother, that even here in Africa, we see you. We honor you. We thank you." Steve pressed his hand harder against his chest, shaking his head slowly as more tears fell. He wasn't just hearing words, he was reliving moments from his past. He remembered the nights when he prayed inside his car, begging God not to let him fail. He remembered the humiliation of not being able to provide for his children in those early years. And he remembered the countless rejections, the doors slammed in his face, the times he almost gave up. Now, to sit on his stage and hear a leader from thousands of miles away call him a symbol of hope, it was more than he could hold inside. The tears were not only from sadness or gratitude, but from the realization that every painful moment of his past had carried meaning far beyond what he ever imagined. He finally lifted his head toward the screen and said softly, "Brother, you got me, man, you got me good. I wasn't ready for this today." His voice cracked again, and the audience chuckled gently, sharing in his emotion while respecting his vulnerability. Ibrahim gave a small smile and nodded as if he could feel Steve's heart from across the ocean. "That is the truth, Steve," he said. "And sometimes the truth makes us cry, not from weakness, but from the weight of love and recognition. Never hide those tears. They are the proof that your heart is still tender, that your spirit is still alive." At that moment, Steve covered his face again, leaning forward, his shoulders moving as he cried openly. The audience erupted in applause, not loud or wild, but long and heartfelt, the kind of applause that carries more emotion than noise. They weren't clapping for entertainment, they were clapping for the man who had given them so much joy, now receiving a gift of love in return. For several moments, Steve could not speak. The cameras stayed on him, but no one expected jokes or words. The silence, filled with the sound of gentle clapping and sniffles from the crowd, spoke louder than anything else. Finally, Steve lifted his head once more, tears streaming down his cheeks but a smile breaking through. He waved his hand slightly toward the screen and whispered again, "Thank you. I needed this. I didn't even know how much I needed this." The audience nodded, many of them crying along with him. They knew this was not just a television moment, it was a life moment, something genuine and unforgettable. Ibrahim, still speaking with calm strength, said, "You are a man who has given laughter to millions, but today it is my turn to give you strength. Let your tears remind you that even the strongest among us need to be reminded of their worth. You are not alone, Steve. You are loved across the world." Steve placed his hand on his chest again and whispered, "Man, God is so good." The audience clapped once more, this time louder, cheering not only for Steve but for the truth of what Ibrahim had said. The atmosphere in the studio was electric with emotion. People who had come expecting laughter were now witnessing one of the most touching and real moments of Steve Harvey's entire career. A television show had turned into something sacred, a reminder of the power of words, the importance of recognition, and the strength of human connection. As the applause died down, Steve leaned back in his chair, his body heavy from the weight of emotion. He wiped his face again and shook his head, muttering, "I never thought this would happen today. I thought I was just coming out here to make people laugh." The audience laughed softly with him, their hearts warmed by his honesty. But it was clear Steve had been changed by this moment. He was no longer just the entertainer on stage. He was a man who had been reminded of his life's purpose, a man who had been given a gift of encouragement from across the world. And as Ibrahim's message reached its final words, Steve knew that this was not just another episode to be aired and forgotten. This was a day that would remain etched in his heart forever. Steve Harvey sat back in his chair, breathing slowly as the final words of Ibrahim Traoré's message echoed in the studio. His heart was full, his mind racing, and his eyes still glistened with tears. For a man who had spent decades making others laugh, this was a moment that made him cry for himself out of gratitude, reflection, and the weight of realization that his life had touched people far beyond what he had ever imagined. The audience remained quiet for a few seconds, unsure if they should speak or move. Then, slowly, applause began, soft at first and then building, until the entire studio was filled with the sound of appreciation. But this was no ordinary applause. It was the kind of applause that comes from witnessing something true and deeply human. They were not clapping for entertainment, they were clapping for connection, for recognition, for love. Steve wiped his eyes with the tissue in his hand and smiled, though it was a tender, emotional smile rather than the broad, confident grin he usually wore on television. He raised his hand slightly, gesturing toward the screen as if to acknowledge Ibrahim directly. "Man, I don't even know what to say," he whispered, his voice still shaking. "Thank you, brother, thank you for this message. I will never forget it." He leaned forward again, elbows on his knees, and allowed himself to take a moment to absorb everything. It was rare for Steve to be speechless, but this was different. This was not about jokes, audience reactions, or television ratings. This was about the recognition of a life lived with purpose, the acknowledgement that his journey mattered to people in ways he had never fully realized. The audience, seeing Steve's vulnerability, felt a wave of emotion themselves. Some of them wiped away tears. Some held their hands over their hearts. Parents thought of their children. Young viewers thought of their dreams. Everyone present could feel the power of this moment not as entertainment, but as a life lesson about faith, perseverance, and human connection. Steve finally spoke again, his voice stronger but still emotional. "Ibrahim, man, what you just said, it hits me in ways I can't explain. I've spent my life trying to make people laugh, trying to teach them lessons, trying to show them hope. And hearing that it reached you, and so many others across the world, man, I can't even begin to describe how that feels." He paused for a moment, swallowing hard, letting the weight of the moment settle over him. Sometimes we don't know how much our lives matter. Sometimes we don't know how far our words travel, how deep our actions touch. Today, you reminded me that everything I've been through, every struggle, every failure, every prayer, it all mattered. It all had a purpose. The audience erupted into applause again, and this time it was louder, filled with a mixture of admiration and shared emotion. Many of them knew Steve's story of struggle, how he had been homeless, how he had faced rejection after rejection, and how he had built himself up with nothing but faith, persistence, and belief in God. To see him moved to tears by the acknowledgement of that journey was a reminder that even the strongest, most successful people have moments of deep vulnerability. Steve's hands trembled slightly as he gestured toward the screen. "Ibrahim, I want you to know that your words, they will stay with me forever. You have reminded me why I keep going, why I keep trying, why I keep believing that what I do matters. And you have reminded me that no matter how far we are from each other, we can still connect as human beings, as brothers in life, as people who care about making the world better." He took a deep breath, letting the tears flow freely. "You see, I spend most of my life giving to others, trying to make them laugh, trying to give them hope. And sometimes I forget to let people give back to me. Today, you gave back to me in the most beautiful way. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart." The studio was quiet again, except for the faint sound of audience members sniffing, wiping tears, or softly saying wow. The energy in the room was unlike any show Steve had ever hosted. This was a moment of pure humanity, a moment where laughter and fame had given way to love, recognition, and deep emotional connection. Steve leaned back slightly and looked out at the audience. "I want all of you to remember something," he said softly, his voice still emotional but firm. "No matter what you go through in life, no matter how many times you fall, no matter how impossible things may seem, your life matters. Every struggle you face has a purpose. Every tear you shed can become a seed for growth. And every act of kindness you give will come back to you in ways you may never imagine." He looked back at the screen one last time. "Ibrahim, your message is a gift. And I promise, I will carry it with me, not just today, not just in this studio, but every single day of my life. It is a reminder that we are all connected, that we all have the power to impact each other's lives, and that even the smallest act of recognition can mean the world to someone who is struggling." The audience cheered again, this time louder than ever, not because it was a performance, but because it was a shared human experience. Steve's tears had become theirs, his emotions had become theirs. And in that moment, everyone in the studio felt part of something greater than entertainment. They felt part of a story about hope, resilience, and the beauty of human connection. Steve wiped his face one final time and smiled through his tears. Man, I never thought today would go like this. I thought I was coming here to make people laugh. But today I have been reminded that life is bigger than laughter. Life is about love, about impact, about touching hearts. And today, Ibrahim, you reminded me of that in a way I will never forget. He leaned forward slightly and spoke to the audience as well. And to everyone watching at home, I want you to know that your life matters too. You never know whose heart you may touch, whose life you may inspire, or whose world you may change just by being who you are. So keep going, keep believing, and never give up, because your story matters just like mine, just like Ibrahim's, and just like everyone's in this world. The cameras slowly panned across the audience, capturing their faces filled with tears, smiles, and silent admiration. It was clear that this was more than a television moment, it was a memory, a lesson, a life-changing experience for everyone present. Steve finally leaned back in his chair, relaxed for the first time that day. The tears were still there, but they were now a part of gratitude, not sorrow. He whispered softly to himself, thank you for reminding me that everything I've been through was worth it. Thank you for reminding me that my life has meaning. Thank you for reminding me that even far away, hearts are connected. And with that, the studio erupted in applause one final time, the kind that lasts, that lingers in the air, and that reminds everyone present that they have witnessed something extraordinary. Steve Harvey, the man who spent his life making others laugh, had been touched deeply himself, and the lesson of hope, resilience, and connection would stay with him forever.